everyone, welcome to this week's lecture, which is all about urban sustainability. So we're going to talk about a couple of things today. First of all, what do we mean by an urban area or a city? What are some of the kind of benefits of living in a city, and what does a sustainable city potentially look like? So urbanization, basically we had early permanent human settlements that were located near supplies of food and resources. Some of those became cities, some of those cities still exist today, and some became centers for trade and industry. But urbanization is just the process by which humans wind up living in densely populated cities or densely populated areas. So all of San Diego and its surrounding area is considered an urban area. You don't have to know all these factors, but where cities developed and how they developed depended on various factors, including the growth of the food supply. So now we are in a day and age where we bring in a lot of our food, although we grow a lot of food very close to San Diego. Various factors such as, can you feed the people who are there? What does the market economy look like? Can you sustain people economically? Do you have the water and waste management systems in place in order to have people there? And do you have a social and government structure in order to sustain that city? And so early cities were certainly plagued with problems. This isn't even an early city, but this is a picture or a drawing of plague in London in 1665, right? If you don't have proper sanitation in a city, if you are overpopulated in a city and you don't have good infrastructure, you can have a lot of issues. But ancient cities, the earliest simple cities were nearly 15,000 years ago, so quite some time ago, and they supported high population density. You had this very kind of specific division of labor in a city, as well as centers for trade. And then the earliest true cities what we would think about today, 6,000 to 8,000 years ago, and these are cities that really also supported society, potentially art and government. So more of what we think of a city of as today, right? Building things like aqueducts. These are in Italy, the Roman aqueducts, right, to get water to a city. Modern cities, those came about from 1750 on, post-industrial revolution or during the industrial revolution. At this point, we get urbanization increasing. You need a much smaller amount of people to produce food. So people are coming into the city for work, which is still happening today, especially in developing countries. Lots of high rates of urbanization in Asia and in parts of sub-Saharan Africa. Lots of people leaving the countryside. We need less people to grow food now, and they are coming to the city for work. So currently, again, urbanization is still at a rapid rate. We passed not that long ago the threshold where over half of the people living on the planet now live in urban areas. And in most developed countries, it's 75% or higher. Some countries it's as high as 90%. We are in the 70s in the United States, I believe. But what also is becoming a major issue is urban poor. So you have a lot of people who are coming to the city who do not have the city cannot sustain them, right? There's not built-in housing for them. So you're getting lots of informal settlements, and I'll talk about that in a second. But lots of people coming from poor areas into the city, and their quality of life not necessarily improving. We also have mega cities, right? Cities with more than 10 million residents. We don't so much have mega cities in the United States, but you can think about mega cities around the world, places like Mumbai and Cairo and Seoul in South Korea. But you get these informal settlements. So this is Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, which is a city that I visited now almost 10 years ago. But Addis is a modern city. You can see here on the right, this is Addis, but this is also Addis. So these informal settlements or slums that take place on the outside of the city, on its periphery, often sometimes have some electricity, often do not have plumbing. So we see this in lots of cities around the world. We also have many cities that are, most of our cities maybe not most, but many of our cities are in coastal areas, because these are where cities traditionally developed. It's easier for trade to be in a coastal area, but this also leads to problems with ocean pollution. So if you have cities such as Addis, which is not in the ocean, but if you have issues with runoff and pollution coming from cities, you can really pollute your waterways as well. So urban settings can be thought of as ecosystems, right? We talked about ecosystems before, but they are basically a region that supports commerce and industry and community interactions of a dense human population, right? Lots of people. Certainly, there are some cities in the world who are much more dense than others. San Diego is not a particularly densely populated city. If you'd visited a densely populated city around the world, you would understand what I mean. But cities also include the physical environment. San Diego has lots of urban canyons that are full of different organisms kind of living in and around the city, lots of biodiversity. So it is that built up man-made environment, but it is also the natural environment in the city. Right, so if we look here, here is Los Angeles. You know, the city is these, the buildings and the freeway, but there is also green space over here. There's some green space over here. We have, generally speaking, more green space in San Diego, but you know, there is an entire ecosystem, and there are things living not in the green space as well. We have problems with urban sprawl, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a second, but basically this idea, especially a lot of what I'm going to talk about for cities and unsustainable cities, a lot of it is a kind of uniquely American phenomena. Urban sprawl is really very often an American issue, where you have a city like Las Vegas, which has grown exponentially. If you look at the satellite imagery from 1972 to 2006, these cities tend to grow outward into kind of suburbia. And there's a lot of issues with urban sprawl, and I'll talk about them, but you can imagine as you grow out, you're using more resources. Look at all the green grass in Las Vegas where there's very little water. And when you have this kind of sprawl, what's happening now is there are more and more people living in suburbs as opposed to in the central location of the city. So if you go between 1910, where most of the population is living, a larger portion of the population is living in the city proper, now in 2000, lots more people living outside of that city in suburbs. And very often, in order to come from those suburbs into the city, they are commuting in order to do so, which creates a host of environmental problems. So causes of urban sprawl, causes of that those cities to spread out like that. Part of it is government policy. San Diego currently has a smart growth policy that is supposed to prevent this from happening anymore. Part of it is economic growth as businesses come in. People they need places for their businesses, but also then people will, want to buy a house, want to have a home, want to have a yard within a commuting distance of that downtown area. Also, transportation issues. It is really hard to ride public transportation consistently in San Diego unless you live right on a bus line and you're going someplace right on a bus line. The trolley goes to a select number of places, but generally speaking, most people in San Diego were getting there by driving. Also, cultural issues. And this is changing, especially in certain cities, but where, living in the city now is becoming a more desirable thing. And we'll talk about the effects of that near the end of this lecture. But generally speaking, for my father's generation, it was kind of the American ideal to get into the suburbs, to buy a house, to have, a yard and a two-car garage. And then also poor urban planning. And again, San Diego is starting to try to fix some of those effects. So when we look at this kind of suburban development here, you can tell a couple of things. Like, generally speaking, you have bigger homes. So they're going to use more resources. You have lots of green lawn space, lots of water. You also have not a lot of direct travel. And this isn't even a particularly egregious suburb, but sometimes there's a lot of these what's called loop and lollipops. But it's hard to get from here over here. There's a lot of going around. You're kind of forced to drive around more. This is done on purpose so that there's not a lot of traffic through neighborhoods, a lot of traffic calming techniques through neighborhoods, but they don't necessarily make for kind of sustainable movement around a city. Some of the consequences of urban sprawl, it degrades the environment, right? Because we are using a lot more resources. It reduces biodiversity. We are taking up natural habitat. It stresses infrastructure, water, electricity, also our freeway system, and also it kind of diminishes human health and well-being. Generally speaking, spending 2 hours of your day in a car, which I frequently do, is not that great for your health and well-being. So, urban planning. We have an urban planning school at San Diego State, but the idea of urban plans and urban planning is to unite various disciplines to build environments and transportation systems for urban communities. It combines engineering and architecture and ecology and sociology. And so now we have urban planners who are trying to, and there have been urban planners for a long time, but urban planners who are really thinking about the sustainability of a city, zoning things for mixed use, right? So having this mix between business and residential, and then setting up an urban growth boundary. So this is what San Diego has. San Diego has an urban growth boundary. So supposedly we are not supposed to have any more massive suburban development outside of this urban growth boundary. What San Diego is trying to do now is infill the city, keep people central to San Diego. So again, the School of Public Affairs has a master's in city planning, should you finish your undergrad and decide you would like to get a master's in city planning. But again, we're not supposed to have that urban growth violate that urban growth boundary, but lots of people are still trying to. This is Lilac Hills Ranch, which is being marketed as a sustainable community. I cannot remember exactly where this stands. It comes up on the ballot, it goes back, it goes forth. The city council recommended it that be approved. They get an exception for it. But generally speaking, people were upset because they say we're trying to get away from this urban sprawl and we need to infill, and Lilac Hills Ranch is not doing that. A lot of people say that we need places like Lilac Hills because we have a housing shortage happening in San Diego. So sustainable urban growth, though, promotes compact communities. So again, that mixed land use, a lot of what you see in San Diego that's happening in places like North Park and Normal Heights, where you have kind of that infill again, and that businesses on the bottom, people living on the top, that mixed land use. It creates a range of housing, ideally. This is a huge problem in San Diego and a lot of places. All of the housing currently that is being put in San Diego and many other cities around the country is high-end housing. We lack low and middle income housing. For you renters out there, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It is very hard to find affordable housing. And it also fosters communities that provide a sense of place. And so what do I mean by that? Fostering communities that provide a sense of place. Ideally, you're fostering neighborhoods where people kind of know their neighbors, interact with their neighbors, and this gives people a sense of ownership over their street and over their community and over their local parks. And so these neighborhoods tend to be better taken care of. And ideally, we're also looking to conserve open space where we can, and farmland and natural beauty and in critical environmental habitats at the same time. So not going back out again to that urban sprawl where we're going to destroy a lot of that land, but we're going to try to conserve it. Ideally, what we want to do is not erase the city and rebuild over it, but strengthening existing communities first. So again, those neighborhoods like North Park and Normal Heights have been all about that infill lately. Provide a variety of transportation. San Diego is not very good at that. We also want walkable neighborhoods. And San Diego is getting good at creating small, walkable neighborhoods. Um, some of our neighborhoods less walkable. Think about how hard it is to go into Mission Valley and walk from one place to another in Mission Valley. But we want to make development decisions be predictable, so that promotes investment. We want them to be fair. We want them to be cost effective. And we want to encourage community collaboration. So we want local residents to be involved in what's happening with their community and how their community is developing. There is a designed kind of an urban planning design called New Urbanism, which has become popular with new developments. Disney's Celebration in Florida is a new urbanist development. But basically, when you are building developments, to build them where you have, so if you notice here, very close together houses, the garages and alleyways and things are in the back. They're made to be extremely walkable, and they include a single family homes like this, and then also that, again, that mixed use development. And the idea here is to create a community where it's very walkable. So from places in the community, you could walk to public transportation, you could walk to the grocery store, and you could walk to the local park. And by creating this walkability, you are then able to get to know your neighbors. This is an example in North Park, where they knocked down the former building that was there, where there was just a few businesses, and they put in this mixed-use development. They've got a coffee shop. There's a brewery there now, Underbelly, the ramen place, and then these are apartments up top. One of the issues with this is these are very expensive apartments in North Park. When we think about urban transportation, right, automobile dependency comes from urban sprawl, right? So sprawl leads to automobiles, which then encourages more sprawl. How long are you willing to commute for that job? And then also in some cases, how far out do you have to live to even find a place to live that you can necessarily afford? So we want to balance transportation options. We want to have good mass transit, including bus and rail, and things that are pedestrian oriented. So that new urbanism that I talked about before, there's one outside of DC where you can walk to everything in there, but then it's also very accessible to the mass transit that gets you into the city. This is gallons of gasoline per person per year. And generally speaking, the US, we use way more gasoline per person, especially places Detroit, Houston, Phoenix, compared to the orange or European cities. Australian cities, the only Canadian city on here, they put a single is Toronto. But generally speaking, we use a lot of gasoline per person in the United States. But different cities are trying to deal with this. Houston built a light rail system. These light rail systems, our trolley in San Diego would be considered a light rail system, are getting more popular. Also building kind of pedestrian friendly areas. So like this street that is, gorgeous to walk down, but a closed to pedestrian traffic, or excuse me, closed to automobile traffic, only open for pedestrians. And we think about like, well, isn't this expensive to build all of this mass transit? But the cost of automobiles is actually really subsidized by the government when you actually think about it, right? So governments build roads and highways to promote and sustain all of this automobile use. So that's a cost that we are paying as a taxpayer. And in many cases, we also provide all of this free parking everywhere. So we are really kind of incentivizing people in the wrong direction to drive all of these automobiles. And then we have all of these externalized costs of automobiles that we don't necessarily think about, but pollution, right? If you live near a freeway or in a city, you are much more subject to the air pollution from those automobiles. You think about traffic, all of those cars sitting there, emitting all of those emissions. And then ecosystem damage. We are cutting through ecosystems by building these freeways through these different landscapes. And then also, economically speaking, all of this traffic and this time sitting in your car reduces productivity. Not just also from a sense of you are more tired because you have now sat in the car for an hour on both ends of your day, but also your amount of time you are going to spend at work and be able to spend at work is reduced. So lots of cities, this is from London, charge you to drive in the city at certain times. It's congestion charging. So as a way to keep people from driving in the city and encouraging public transportation, you are going to be charged between 7 a.m. and 6 p.m. to drive into the city. Honolulu, if you have visited Hawaii on Oahu, Honolulu is a beautiful city, but has some of the worst traffic in the country, if not the worst traffic in the country. So to try to deal with this really horrifyingly bad traffic, which I spent a summer doing research in Hawaii and I sat in a lot of this traffic, they proposed a light rail system, which a lot of people are actually against the light rail system. They say that they should increase the bus system instead because and have a rapid bus lane. Mainly because to build this light rail system, they will have to destroy a lot of natural habitat to do it. So a lot of people promoting kind of use what we have first in order to kind of give us more sustainable options. But when we think about our sustainability, again, remember I talked about it being an ecosystem. What we ideally want is all the inputs in the city coming from a relatively local area, which is not the case now. We're going to talk next module about food and kind of where food comes from, how close to you food comes from. And we want to produce as much of our own energy efficiently as we can, and we want to output very little waste. Right now, cities output tons of waste, right? We want to have good recycling, and we want to do that reduce and reuse part. But cities can really be sustainable places. Per capita emissions from cities are typically smaller than their nation's average. You use less resources when you're in a city. You are more likely to ride public transportation. You are more likely to have a smaller home that uses less resources, right? Generally speaking, they have more public transportation. If you live in rural areas, public transportation is limited. And well-planned cities can decrease commute lengths, right? Which is not just good for the environment, but also improves your quality of life. I do not teach on campus at SDSU this semester, but I teach at a different CSU, and my commute right now is about 40 miles. And I would love to have a public transportation option to get there. And many cities are trying to be greener, literally, right? Increasing green space even on the buildings. This is the Academy of Science in San Francisco, which has this amazing green kind of living roof. This building is naturally climate controlled. This is a fantastic place to visit. If you are in San Francisco, I highly recommend it. They have a rainforest inside, but the way that they've built this building is that so through a system of kind of vents and openings, they can naturally climate control the city. And part of the building, and part of that is the green roof. Green roofs have all types of environmental benefits. We have a green roof on our newish student center. They filter toxins from both the air and the water. They absorb carbon dioxide. They retain rainwater and slow runoff. They insulate against sound pollution. They reduce city temperatures. So you don't have these black roofs that are just absorbing all of this heat, making the city hotter. And they enhance biodiversity. Things wind up moving in and living in these spaces. And they have societal benefits. They're beautiful. Who doesn't want a beautiful green roof? They create new work and social spaces. Some of these green roofs are accessible, and they make cities a nicer place to work and live. There's economic benefits. They are more energy efficient. They enhance fireproofing, and they increase property values. So as far as I'm concerned, all of these big buildings should be moving over to green roofs. And again, we have somewhat of a green roof on our new-ish student center. This is Facebook's newer campus in Menlo Park. their expansion. This is a massive green roof that has a massive native plant garden on it. It is huge. I was lucky enough to visit it and walk around. It is truly impressive. But building buildings with this type of things in mind, and then this building now requires less air conditioning because of this green roof. Also creating innovative parks. This is Highline Park. I'm not going to talk about it too much because you are going to watch a short video after this about Highline Park, where they took this kind of old railway platform that was just sitting there and turned it into kind of this amazing park space in New York. Also, you can get increased urban food options from greening your city, which I'll talk more about this in particular in the next module, including community gardens. But cities are, I'm an environmentalist and a sustainability person, and cities are really where it's at for me. Urbanization can improve lives and build a healthier planet. There are all types of great environmental and social and economic reasons to live in cities. Density of people tends to boost creativity. It ensures that residents are close to where they live and work. Diversity of opinions and people can spur faster and smarter growth. And sound land use planning and formalization can make efficient land and energy use, give residents ownership of land and standing, and unleash creative energy and growth, as well as a commitment by urban residents to the sustainability of their community. So this is kind of a little bit of a recap of what I was just saying. But cities can be amazing, sustainable, and wonderfully environmentally friendly places. Just really quick kind of a side of this. We think about globalization, which again, I've taken a little bit of a left turn here, but I'll tell you why. Globalization has led to increased diversity in the United States. So while we have always had quite a bit of diversity in the United States, we have even more so now. But what was happening, we are living in more homogenized spaces than ever before. We are self-segregating, and suburbs are one of the ways in which we do that. If you think about kind of gated communities and suburbs, a lot of the planning is kind of based off being afraid of other people, right? So you have a gated community where you might have to pass by a guardhouse to get in. You might have, I visited one where there was a guardhouse to get into the community, and then each piece of property had their own security system and fence. So really kind of closing yourself off from other people, right? So when you think about these kind of communities, right, lots of gates, lots of kind of not right engaging necessarily with your local community. And what we've also had is this kind of privatization of public spaces in cities as well. So if we want to think about public spaces, like who is welcome? Everyone? Maybe not, right? What is a place like Balboa Park really made for? Who is that made for? Who is welcome in Balboa Park and who is not? Tourists, middle and upper class people, are homeless people welcome, right? Balboa Park was built for the Panama Exposition in the early 1900s. But, generally speaking, a lot of Balboa Park, while residents do use it, and I certainly use Balboa Park, a lot of it is geared towards tourists and not geared towards everybody. And when we think about places like the convention center downtown, right? So we have this massive convention center downtown that basically has prevented us from knowing that we are right near the water. You could be in downtown San Diego and have no idea that you are right next to the water. So who was that developed for? Some of the new plans for the convention center includes creating access to a roof space where you could actually see that you are near the water. And then also kind of thinking about how we deal with urban poor and homeless. We have all types of ways that we basically prevent people from laying down in public. And this is largely to deal with homeless. So you have benches that have these kind of dividers in them. This is another example of them. Weird seating options, right? Nobody is going to lay down on any of these options. All the way up until you have things like spikes in different kind of corners that are a little bit hidden to prevent people from sleeping there. One of the things that is really, really difficult for homeless people to do is to find a place to sleep for long periods of time that is relatively safe and comfortable. We also have movements for urban revitalization, and so we can think about this. A great example of this is Petco Park. So downtown San Diego was a lot of kind of these short-term residency hotels, which is basically kind of like the last step before becoming homeless. And the city, we put in a ballpark down there. We put in a lot of kind of, higher income housing down there. A lot was empty after the housing crisis in 2008, but a lot of it's filled back in. So when we think about this area, it was like, okay, all of these homeless people that were downtown, and while we have a bigger homeless problem now, we're relatively removed, but they were just moved someplace else, right? So a lot of these urban revitalization efforts don't necessarily benefit who is there. And so this happens also through a process called gentrification. And gentrification is a process by which middle-class people take up residence in a traditionally working-class area of the city, changing the character of an area. So when I first moved to San Diego, North Park and Normal Heights were much more affordable than they are now. They have gone through a gentrification process, so has South Park. And now places like Barrio Logan are trying to kind of fight this off, because you wind up, people who have rented there for a long time, they wind up with no place to go. It can potentially increase homelessness. You're going to watch a video after the Highline Park one. You're going to watch a longer one that's about 20 minutes long, and that's what your writing exercise this week is going to be about. You're going to watch this one on the Mission in San Francisco and kind of what gentrification looks like in the Mission. And that is it for our lecture on urban sustainability.